Ethan had seen that kind of bruise before. In war. Not on the wrist of an old woman in a quiet coffee shop. Outside, a brutal winter storm buried the mountain town in silence. Inside, Ethan thought he had finally found peace, until that single bruise told him the violence had never truly left. A retired Navy SEAL seeking peace in a frozen mountain town finds his sanctuary breached by a fragile elderly couple, only to discover that the bruises on a woman's wrist tell a story far more violent than the storm raging outside. The windows of the Harbor Lane Cafe were thick with frost crystalline patterns crawling across the glass like frozen lace. Outside, Sandpoint, Idaho had vanished. For 48 hours, the sky had been a relentless churning void of white and gray dumping feet of snow that buried cars and silenced the world. The wind shrieked through the narrow alleys, a primal sound that made the timber-framed building groan in protest. Inside, however, the air was a thick, intoxicating blend of roasted Arabica beans, sweet maple syrup, and the earthy scent of damp wool. It was an amber-lit sanctuary, a gold-hued bubble of warmth protected by heavy oak doors, and the sheer stubbornness of the locals. Ethan Cole sat in the far corner, his back against the brick wall. He was a man who inhabited space with a heavy, deliberate stillness. His frame was broad, his shoulders stretching the fabric of a faded charcoal hoodie, and his face was a map of hard-won experience. A jagged scar traced a thin line from his temple down to his jaw, a permanent souvenir of a roadside in Kandahar. Beside his heavy leather boots, a black German shepherd named Shadow lay perfectly flat. The dog's eyes were open, golden and unblinking, tracking every movement in the room with a professional detachment that mirrored his master's. Ethan didn't look at his phone. He didn't read a book. He simply watched the steam rise from his black coffee, his mind a quiet fortress. The bell above the door chimed a lonely sound, quickly swallowed by the roar of the wind that rushed in. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees in an instant. Through the swirling white mist, two figures appeared like ghosts emerging from a dream. They were elderly, hunched against the gale, clinging to one another, as if they were the only two solid objects left in a disintegrating universe. Walter Elliston, his face a landscape of deep-set wrinkles and blue-tinged skin, gripped a worn wooden cane with knuckles that were white from the cold. His wife June was wrapped in a coat that looked decades old, her small frame trembling so violently that the buttons rattled. The cafe was crowded. Every velvet armchair and polished wooden stool was occupied by skiers waiting out the storm, or locals gossiping over lattes. As the couple shuffled forward, their boots squeaking on the hardwood floor, the conversation in the room barely dipped. People glanced up, saw the shivering pair, and then returned to their screens or their conversations. There was a collective silent refusal to acknowledge the inconvenience of their suffering. Walter looked around, his eyes clouded with cataracts and exhaustion, searching for a place to let June sit. She was swaying, her breathing shallow and ragged, her gloved hand clutching Walter's arm with a desperate white-knuckled grip. Ethan observed the scene with the cold, analytical precision of a predator. He saw the way the young man at the center table deliberately avoided eye contact, tilting his laptop screen up. He saw the group of teenagers in the booth laughing, oblivious to the fact that the woman 10 feet away looked like she was about to expire. Ethan's jaw tightened. He didn't like the noise of the world, and he didn't like people, but he had a biological intolerance for the neglect of the weak. He felt Shadow shift beside him, the dog's ears swiveling toward the couple, sensing the spike in Ethan's adrenaline. June took a step forward, her legs buckling. The floor near the entrance was slick with melted slush, a treacherous mirror of ice. Walter tried to steady her, but his own strength was spent. His cane slipped on the wet wood, and for a terrifying second gravity claimed them both. The room seemed to slow down. The clatter of spoons and the hiss of the espresso machine faded into the background as the elderly woman began to fall, her eyes wide with a quiet, resigned terror. Before she could hit the floor, Ethan was there. He didn't run. He moved with the explosive, economical grace of a soldier who had spent a lifetime training his body to respond before his brain could even process the command. In one fluid motion, he was out of his chair and across the room. He caught June by the upper arms, his large, calloused hands acting like shock absorbers. He didn't just stop her fall. He lifted her, easing the pressure on her brittle joints. At the same time, his boot shot out, hooking the base of a nearby empty chair and sliding it perfectly into place behind her. Shadow was a half step behind him. The dog didn't bark or growl. He simply stood between the couple and the rest of the room, a black wall of fur and muscle. He didn't look at the couple. He looked at the crowd, his gaze a silent command for everyone to stay back. The cafe went silent. The hikers stopped talking. The barista froze with a pitcher of milk in midair. The sudden, intense presence of the veteran and his dog had sucked all the oxygen out of the room. "Easy, ma'am," Ethan said, his voice, a low, gravelly rumble that carried the authority of a command and the softness of a prayer. "I've got you." He guided June into the chair. Walter, leaning heavily on Ethan's shoulder, let out a long, shuddering breath that sounded like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "Thank you, son," the old man wheezed, his voice cracking. "Thank you. I thought we were gone there for a second." Ethan didn't respond with words. He reached out to help June adjust her heavy wool sleeve, which had pushed up during the scuffle. His intent was merely to ensure she was comfortable to pull the fabric back down over her thin, shivering arm. But as he gripped the cuff of her coat, the amber light of the cafe hit her pale skin directly. Ethan froze. His thumb was resting just above her wrist. There, stark against the translucent, paper-thin skin, was a bruise. It wasn't the mottled purple of a fall or the yellowing mark of an accidental bump. It was a series of 4 distinct dark finger-shaped marks circling her wrist like a macabre bracelet. They were fresh, deep, and unmistakable. Someone had grabbed her with terrifying force, squeezing until the capillaries burst. Ethan's eyes flickered from the bruise to June's face. She looked up at him, and for a brief moment, the exhaustion in her eyes was replaced by something else, a piercing, jagged fear. She quickly pulled her arm back, tucking it deep into the folds of her coat, her gaze dropping to the floor. Walter was busy wiping his glasses, oblivious to the silent exchange, his hands still shaking from the cold. The heat of the cafe suddenly felt oppressive to Ethan. The smell of maple syrup felt cloying and sick. He looked at the mark again in his mind's eye, measuring the distance between the finger imprints. It was a man's grip, a strong man. He looked at Walter's trembling, arthritic hands. They were weak, barely able to hold a cane, let alone leave a mark like that. The storm outside was screaming, but as Ethan stood there looking at the silent, terrified woman, he realized the real danger wasn't the frost or the wind. It was something they had brought inside with them, hidden beneath the layers of wool and the veneer of age. He stepped back, his hand instinctively dropping to Shadow's head, feeling the dog's low, rhythmic pulse. The sanctuary of the Harbor Lane Cafe had been breached, and the war Ethan thought he had left behind in the desert was suddenly standing right in front of him. The steam from the espresso machine hissed a sharp, rhythmic sound that cut through the heavy silence of the Harbor Lane Cafe. Ethan moved with a practiced, fluid grace, his hands performing the delicate dance of a barista, while his mind remained locked in the cold, calculated precision of a scout. He wasn't just making a latte and a chamomile tea. He was recalibrating his reality. The bruise on June's wrist was a map, and every dark purplish ridge told a story of violence that Ethan knew all too well. It was the mark of a predator, someone who used their strength not to protect but to dominate. He carried the tray to the back booth, the furthest corner of the room, where the shadows were deepest and the prying eyes of the street were blocked by a display of vintage coffee grinders. He set the porcelain cups down with a soft click. The aroma of roasted beans and dried flowers rose between them, a temporary barricade against the freezing world outside. Ethan didn't leave. He pulled out a chair from the adjacent table, turned it around, and sat, his posture relaxed, but his eyes never losing their razor-sharp focus. Walter tried to sit up straighter, his gnarled hands clutching the warm mug as if it were a lifebuoy in a stormy sea. He was trying to maintain a shred of the dignity he had spent 80 years building, but the way his lower lip trembled betrayed him. Beside him, June was a ghost of a woman. She kept her head down, her chin tucked into the collar of her worn wool coat. Her hands were hidden beneath the table, but Ethan could see the slight rhythmic shaking of her shoulders. She wasn't just cold. She was vibrating with a deep systemic terror. "Drink the tea, June," Ethan said, his voice dropping into a low, soothing frequency, the same tone he had used to calm panicked privates in the middle of a firefight. "It's got honey in it. It'll help the shaking." June didn't move. She looked at the steam rising from the cup, her eyes glazed. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his presence filling the small space. He didn't rush her. He knew that secrets like deep-seated wounds needed to be bled out slowly. He let his gaze drift to the sleeve of her coat, where the dark marks were hidden. "That's a nasty grip mark on your wrist," June, Ethan said quietly, his voice devoid of judgment but heavy with the weight of an observation that couldn't be ignored. "I've seen a lot of injuries. That didn't come from a fall. Someone held you down. Hard." June flinched as if he had struck her. Her eyes darted toward the front door, wide and panicked, looking for an exit that didn't involve walking back into the snow. I'm just clumsy, Ethan," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry parchment. "The ice. I slipped on the porch. Walter tried to catch me. It was just an accident." Ethan looked at Walter. The old man's eyes filled with a sudden, agonizing shame. He looked down at his own hands, thin-spotted with age and so weak they could barely lift the coffee mug without a struggle. Walter knew the lie was transparent. He knew that Ethan, a man who moved with the lethal efficiency of a coiled spring, saw right through the fabrication. "Walter didn't do that," Ethan said, his voice as cold as the frost on the window pane. "Walter couldn't do that if he tried. Those marks were made by someone much younger, someone with a lot of anger and no soul." The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by the howling wind outside and the low hum of the refrigerator. Walter let out a long, shuddering breath that turned into a sob. He covered his face with one hand, his shoulders slumping as the last of his defenses crumbled. June reached out to touch his arm, her own fear momentarily eclipsed by the sight of her husband's broken spirit. "It's Colin." Walter finally whispered the name, sounding like a curse. "Our grandson. He moved in 6 months ago, after he lost his job. Or so he said. At first it was just asking for a bit of money. Then it was the car. Then he started taking the Social Security checks before we could even see them." Ethan felt a familiar dark heat rising in his chest, the black sun of his rage that he usually kept buried under layers of routine and espresso foam. He stayed silent, letting Walter continue. He knew that once the dam broke, the whole truth would come pouring out. "He calls us dead weight," Walter said, his voice raspy with a mixture of grief and fury. "He stands over us while we eat and tells us how much the electricity costs just to keep us alive. He says we're breathing his air. He gets frustrated when June doesn't move fast enough. He says she's doing it on purpose to spite him." Ethan's grip tightened on the back of the chair, the wood creaking under his strength. He pictured this Colin, probably a hollowed-out shell of a man who felt big by making others feel small. A coward who preyed on the very people who had given him life. Ethan's mind began to run through tactical scenarios, his training overriding his civilian persona. He saw the house on the hill, the isolation of the snow, the vulnerability of the couple. He took the phones. June added her voice, a tiny haunting sound. He said, "We don't need to talk to anyone. That the world has forgotten about us anyway. Tonight." Tonight Walter tried to hide his wallet. Colin found it. He grabbed me. He grabbed me and told me that if Walter ever tried to hide anything again, he'd put us both out in the barn. Without blankets. She looked at Ethan, her eyes pleading for something he wasn't sure he could give peace. "We just wanted a moment of warmth. We walked 3 miles in this storm just to sit here for an hour, just to feel like humans again." Ethan reached out and placed his hand over Walter's shaking one. It was a rare gesture of physical contact for him, but he felt the man's pulse thready, fast and terrified. "You're not dead weight, Walter, and you're not alone anymore." Suddenly, Shadow, who had been lying perfectly still at Ethan's feet, sat bolt upright. The dog's ears pricked forward, his body tensing into a singular line of muscle. A low, vibrating growl started deep in his chest, a sound that wasn't a bark, but a warning. It was the sound Shadow made when a threat was no longer an idea, but a presence. Ethan stood up slowly, his eyes shifting from the couple to the large front window. Through the swirling white curtain of the blizzard, 2 dim yellow headlights appeared at the edge of the parking lot. A gray pickup truck, its engine idling with a rough, uneven chug, pulled into the slushy lot. The driver didn't turn off the lights. They sat there, the beams cutting through the dark, illuminating the falling snow like twin searchlights. June gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "He's here," she choked out. "He followed us." Walter's face went deathly pale. He tried to stand, but his knees buckled and he sank back into the booth, his eyes fixed on the silhouette of the truck. The sanctuary of the cafe felt suddenly very small, and the glass of the windows felt dangerously thin. Ethan didn't move toward the door. He didn't reach for a weapon he no longer carried. Instead, he reached over and turned off the overhead light of the booth, plunging the three of them into the amber glow of the small table lamp. He looked at the truck, his expression becoming a mask of cold, unyielding iron. The war he thought he had left in the desert hadn't just followed him home, it had pulled into his parking lot. "Stay in the booth," Ethan said, his voice no longer soothing but commanding. It was the voice of a man who was no longer a barista. "Shadow watch them." The dog moved instantly, positioning himself at the end of the booth, his eyes locked on the front door, a black sentinel in the gloom. Ethan walked toward the counter, his steps silent. He didn't look back at the couple. He was focused on the shadow behind the steering wheel of the gray truck, measuring the distance, calculating the timing, and welcoming the coldness that was spreading through his veins. The language of bruises was about to be answered in a language even more ancient. The engine of the gray pickup truck did not merely rumble. It vibrated through the floorboards of the cafe, a low-frequency growl that seemed to unsettle the very air inside. The cozy warmth of the shop, once a sanctuary of roasted beans and soft jazz, had curdled into something suffocating. The yellow glow of the overhead lamps no longer felt welcoming. It felt like a spotlight on a stage where a tragedy was about to unfold. Outside, the blizzard continued its relentless assault, but the real storm sat idling in the parking lot, shrouded in exhaust fumes and malice. Through the fogged glass of the front window, a figure began to take shape. The driver's side door creaked open, and a man stepped out into the slush. He didn't rush. He didn't charge toward the door with the hot-headed fury of a common brawler. Instead, he leaned against the hood of his truck, his silhouette framed by the harsh, horizontal beams of his headlights. This was Colin Elliston. He was a man whose history was written in the broken capillaries of his nose, and the deep, bitter lines etched around a mouth that had tasted too much cheap whiskey and not enough grace. Even through the distorted glass, his eyes burned with a cold, proprietary resentment. Inside, the silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and the ragged, shallow breathing of June. She sat frozen, her fingers digging into the vinyl of the booth until her knuckles turned white. Walter beside her looked like a man who had already accepted his execution. The fear radiating from them was palpable, a sour scent that seemed to fill the room. Ethan stood behind the counter, his posture eerily still. He wasn't reaching for the phone, nor was he looking for a weapon. He was simply observing his mind, cataloging the threat with the detached precision of a veteran who had seen far worse monsters in far more desolate places. Lydia, the young waitress who had been wiping down the back counter, stopped mid-motion. She looked from the terrifying figure outside to the trembling couple in the booth, then finally at Ethan. She felt the shift in the room, the way the atmosphere had thickened, making it hard to draw a full breath. She stayed back, her hand hovering near the edge of the espresso machine, sensing that the ordinary rules of her world had just been suspended. This was no longer a simple breakfast service. It was a siege. Colin began to move. He didn't walk to the door. Instead, he drifted toward the large plate glass window, his boots crunching loudly on the frozen gravel. He stopped inches from the glass, his face illuminated by the interior light. He looked directly at June, ignoring Ethan and Walter, as if they were nothing more than furniture. His expression wasn't one of rage, but of a terrifying, calm entitlement. He was a predator watching his prey through the bars of a cage, savoring the moment before the kill. He wanted them to feel the weight of his presence, to understand that there was nowhere they could go that he couldn't find. Then came the sound. Colin raised his right hand, a heavy silver ring glinting on his finger. Slowly, deliberately, he began to tap the ring against the glass. Clink, clink, clink. It was a rhythmic, metallic sound sharp enough to pierce through the hum of the refrigerators. Each strike was a needle prick to the nerves. June flinched with every tap, her shoulders jerking as if she were being physically struck. The sound was a signature, a psychological brand that Colin used to remind her that she belonged to him, that her safety was an illusion he could shatter whenever he chose. Ethan's eyes narrowed. The sound of the ring against the glass triggered something deep within him, a memory of metal on metal in a different desert, a different life. He felt the familiar coldness settle into his marrow, the quiet place he used to go when the world turned into a kill zone. He didn't move toward the window. He didn't shout. He simply reached down and placed a steady hand on Shadow's heavy leather collar. The dog felt the tension in his master's grip and let out a sound that wasn't a growl, but a low, vibrating hum of readiness. Ethan looked up his gaze, locking onto Colin's through the glass. For the first time, Colin's predatory smirk faltered. He saw something in Ethan's eyes that didn't belong in a small-town cafe. He didn't see fear or anger or even a challenge. He saw an abyss. He saw the eyes of a man who had walked through fire and come out the other side with nothing left to lose. For a split second, the bully felt a flicker of genuine primal instinct, the urge to run. Colin flinched a microscopic twitch of his head before his pride forced him to hold his ground. The standoff stretched a thin wire pulled to the breaking point. The blizzard outside seemed to intensify, the wind howling around the corners of the building like a chorus of ghosts. Ethan realized then that the situation had moved beyond words or simple intervention. He looked at June's trembling form and Walter's hollow eyes. He knew the history of men like Colin Elliston. Men like that didn't stop because they were told to. They didn't stop because of a restraining order or a stern warning. They only stopped when they were broken. Ethan looked back at the gray truck, then at the road that led toward the Elliston farmhouse. He knew that if he let them walk out that door alone, if he let them drive back to that isolated house on the edge of the woods, they wouldn't survive the winter. The house wasn't a home. It was a graveyard waiting for its inhabitants. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He couldn't just be a witness anymore. To save them, he would have to step back into the shadow he had tried so hard to leave behind. The air outside the cafe did not just bite, it consumed. It was a living, breathing wall of white that sought to erase everything in its path. Ethan gripped June by the elbow, his touch firm but not forceful, guiding her through the swirling chaos toward his parked vehicle. Walter followed closely behind his shoulders, hunched his head bowed, as if expecting a blow from the sky itself. The snow was already several inches deep on the pavement, muffling their footsteps and turning the world into a silent, monochromatic blur. Ethan's Ford F-250 sat like a hunched beast under a layer of frost, its heavy-duty tires biting into the treacherous ground. It was an old machine, scarred and utilitarian, much like the man who owned it. Ethan opened the heavy passenger door, ushering June and Walter into the cramped cabin. The interior smelled of old leather gun oil and the lingering scent of Shadow, who had already leaped into the narrow back bench, his yellow eyes glowing in the shadows. Ethan didn't waste time with reassurances. He climbed into the driver's seat, the engine roaring to life with a deep guttural growl that shook the frame of the truck. He engaged the four-wheel drive, the mechanical clunk echoing his own internal shift into a state of combat readiness. He checked his side mirrors, clearing a patch of frost with his gloved thumb. Through the veil of falling snow, he saw the twin pinpricks of light from the gray pickup. Colin wasn't leaving. He was waiting. The truck lurched forward, its tires churning through the slush as Ethan turned away from the main road. He knew the geography of Sandpoint better than most, having spent his solitary years mapping the logging trails and service roads that crisscrossed the mountains. If he stayed on the highway, he was a target. On the logging roads, he was a predator in his own territory. June sat frozen in the middle seat, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white as the snow outside. Walter stared out the window, his breath fogging the glass, looking like a man who had already accepted his fate. Ethan reached over and turned the heater to its maximum setting, though the warmth did little to thaw the icy dread filling the cabin. As they cleared the outskirts of the town, the streetlights vanished, replaced by the towering, oppressive shadows of the pine forest. The logging road was narrow, a mere ribbon of gray between the white-laden branches that arched overhead like the ribs of a cathedral. The wind howled through the gaps, throwing sheets of snow across the windshield. Ethan watched the rearview mirror. For a few minutes, there was only darkness. Then a pair of high beams crested the rise behind them, cutting through the storm with aggressive brilliance. The gray pickup was gaining ground, its engine screaming as Colin pushed the vehicle beyond the limits of safety on the slick surface. Ethan didn't speed up. He maintained a steady, calculated pace, feeling the weight of the Ford and the way it interacted with the ice beneath. He was testing the road, finding the rhythm of the skids. Behind them, Colin was driving with the reckless abandon of a man who believed himself invincible. The high beams splashed against Ethan's interior, reflecting off the glass and blinding him. Colin was tailgating now, the heavy steel bumper of the gray truck inches away from Ethan's tailgate. The roar of the pursuit drowned out the wind. June let out a small, choked gasp as the first impact occurred, a jarring metal-on-metal thud that sent a shockwave through the Ford. Colin was trying to pit them to catch the corner of the Ford and send it spinning into the ravine that lined the right side of the road. Ethan felt the rear end of his truck kick out as Colin rammed him again, harder this time. The Ford slid toward the edge, the tires screaming for purchase on the black ice. Inside the cabin, Walter cried out, burying his face in his hands. Ethan's hands remained steady on the wheel. He didn't fight the skid. He steered into it using the truck's own momentum to stabilize the frame. His mind was a cold machine, calculating distances, friction coefficients, and the exact moment of the next strike. He knew this road. He knew there was a sharp banked turn coming up, one where the snow had drifted deep against a granite outcropping. He saw the bend in the distance, a dark curve highlighted by the pale glow of the moon struggling through the clouds. Colin was revving his engine, preparing for a final heavy ram that would push the Ford off the road for good. Ethan shifted gears, his movements fluid and precise. He waited until the very last second, until he could see the distorted, snarling face of Colin in his side mirror, illuminated by the backscatter of the headlights. Colin lunged the gray truck, surging forward like a shark. Ethan didn't brake. He tapped the emergency brake and flicked the wheel, initiating a controlled tactical power slide that swung the heavy rear of the Ford across the path of the gray pickup. The timing was perfect. Colin, committed to his straight-line charge, had no time to react. The Ford's reinforced bumper clipped the front fender of the gray truck, not enough to stop the Ford, but enough to redirect Colin's momentum. The gray pickup, caught in its own high-speed rush, overshot the turn. Its tires hit the deep, soft powder of the snowbank at the edge of the road. The vehicle groaned, its nose dipping into the white abyss as it plowed forward, the engine dying with a wet, sputtering hiss. The gray truck didn't flip, but it was buried up to its axles, its wheels spinning uselessly in the frozen earth. Ethan brought the Ford to a halt 50 yards down the road, the engine idling in a low, rhythmic thrum. He didn't get out. He sat there watching the mirror. The silence that followed the crash was deafening, broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine and the heavy breathing of the passengers. In the distance, the door of the gray truck flew open, struggling against the weight of the snow. Colin Elliston emerged, a dark silhouette against the white landscape. He was screaming, his voice thin and ragged, carried away by the wind. He looked small and pathetic against the backdrop of the ancient forest, a man stripped of his power the moment his machine failed him. Ethan rolled down his window just an inch. The freezing air rushed in, smelling of pine and ozone. Colin's voice reached them, a jagged edge of sound. "I have the deed, you old fool, Colin!" shrieked his arm, outstretched, pointing a trembling finger at the Ford. "I own that land. I own them. You can't hide them from the law. I have the papers. They belong to me." The words were those of a man who viewed human beings as property, as items to be traded and possessed. Walter, sitting in the back, let out a shuddering breath, his head sinking lower. The threat of the deed seemed to carry more weight than the physical violence they had just escaped. Ethan didn't respond. He didn't shout back or offer a middle finger. He simply looked at the man in the snow with a cold, detached pity. He knew that for men like Colin, the law was a weapon they used to justify their cruelty, a shield they hid behind when their own strength failed. But the law of the woods was different. Out here in the heart of the storm, deeds and papers meant nothing. Only survival mattered. Ethan rolled the window back up the seal, cutting off Colin's frantic rants. He put the truck back into gear and began to drive again, leaving the gray ghost of the pickup and its master behind in the dark. The road ahead was even more treacherous, leading deeper into the wilderness, where the safe house waited a cabin built of cedar and secrets hidden in a valley that didn't appear on any modern map. As the Ford climbed higher into the mountains, the wind began to die down, leaving a heavy, expectant stillness in its wake. June finally let go of her seat, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch Walter's arm. They were safe for now, but the look in Ethan's eyes told them the war had only just begun. The pursuit had ended, but the hunt was far from over. The air inside room 214 of the Pinecrest Motel was thick with the scent of industrial-grade lemon bleach and the underlying rot of damp floorboards. A single neon sign flickered outside the window, casting rhythmic pulses of sickly pink light across the popcorn ceiling. Ethan stood by the heavy curtains, his hand resting on the fabric as he peered through a narrow gap. Outside, the rain had turned into a freezing drizzle, coating the asphalt of the parking lot in a treacherous sheen of black ice. He didn't look back at the room, but he could hear the rhythmic clicking of a keyboard and the rustle of ancient yellowed paper. This was no longer a place of rest. It had been stripped of its meager comfort and transformed into a war room, a tactical hub, where the weapons were not rifles but records, bank statements, and the cold hard truth. In the center of the small room, Mark Rivera sat hunched over a folding table he had brought in his own truck. Mark was a man built like a granite block, his hair peppered with gray and his eyes carrying the permanent squint of someone who had spent too many years looking through a long-range scope. A fellow veteran and a private investigator with a reputation for finding people who didn't want to be found, Mark moved with a quiet, efficient precision. Beside him, Grace Dalton was a whirlwind of controlled fury. A pro bono attorney who had spent her career defending the elderly from the vultures of the corporate world, she looked out of place in the sterile motel room with her sharp blazer and tired eyes, yet she wielded a highlighter like a scalpel cutting through the layers of deception Colin had left behind. The Ellistons sat on the edge of the sagging, queen-sized bed, their shadows stretched long against the beige wallpaper. Walter held June's hand, his knuckles white, his gaze fixed on the floor. They looked small in the presence of the investigators, two people who had been hunted by their own blood, and were now waiting to see if there was anything left of the life they had built. Ethan turned away from the window, his boots thudding softly on the stained carpet. He looked at the chaos of documents, the paper trail of a betrayal so deep it felt like a physical wound in the room. Mark tapped a key on his laptop, and a series of spreadsheets filled the screen. He rubbed his jaw, the sound of his stubble rasping in the quiet room. He had been digging into Colin's digital footprint for 3 hours, tracing the movement of funds through a web of shell companies and offshore accounts. Grace, meanwhile, was cross-referencing property records from the county clerk's office with the bank statements Ethan had managed to recover from the house. The deeper they dug, the uglier the picture became. It wasn't just about the pension checks anymore. It was about a systematic erasure of a family's existence. Grace sighed, a jagged sound that drew everyone's attention. She pulled a document from a manila folder and laid it flat on the table, her finger trembling slightly as she pointed to a signature at the bottom. She looked up at Ethan, her expression a mixture of pity and professional outrage. She explained that the paperwork they were looking at was a deed transfer for the Ellistons' ancestral home. It was dated 3 weeks ago, bearing Walter's signature, but the ink was slightly off, and the notary stamp belonged to a firm that had been shut down for fraud 2 years prior. It was a forgery, but a sophisticated one designed to pass a cursory glance long enough for a transaction to clear. Mark leaned back his chair, creaking under his weight. He added the final piece of the puzzle, his voice low and gravelly. He told them that Colin hadn't just stolen the house. He had already entered into a contract with a major land developer. The developer planned to clear the entire ridge, including the ancient forest and the Ellistons' home, to make way for a luxury mountain resort. The sale was in its final stages of escrow. If the papers were finalized in the next 48 hours, the house would be demolished before any legal challenge could even reach a judge's desk. The Ellistons weren't just being robbed, they were being deleted. The room fell into a suffocating silence. Walter let out a broken sound, a half-sob that he quickly stifled with his hand. June leaned her head against his shoulder, her eyes closed, as if she could shut out the reality of their home being torn down. Ethan felt a cold, white-hot rage bubbling in his chest. He had seen men do terrible things in war, but the calculated, cold-blooded theft of a legacy by one's own son was a different kind of evil. It was a betrayal of the soul. He looked at Mark, his eyes asking the question his voice couldn't form. They needed something more. They needed proof of intent, something that would strip away Colin's legal shield and reveal him for the predator he was. Mark reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, battered digital recorder. He explained that while he was clearing the Ellistons' house before the police arrived, he had found this hidden behind a loose baseboard in the basement. It belonged to Walter. The old man looked up, his eyes widening in realization. He had forgotten he had left it there, a desperate attempt to record the threats Colin had been making when they were alone, a small insurance policy he had been too terrified to use. Mark pressed the play button, the device's small speaker crackling with static, before a voice filled the room. The voice was unmistakably Colin's, but it lacked the oily charm he used in public. It was sharp, cruel, and dripping with contempt. The recording captured a conversation from a month ago. In it, Colin could be heard screaming at Walter, demanding he sign the final deed transfer. When Walter refused, citing the generations of Ellistons who had lived on that land, Colin's voice turned chillingly calm. He told his father that if he didn't sign, he would move them both into the unheated basement for the winter. He told them he would stop buying their medication and let the cold do the work that he was too busy to finish. He called them burdens, dead weight, and obstacles to his future. The audio ended with the sound of a door slamming and June's muffled weeping. In the motel room, no one moved. The pink neon light continued to pulse, a heartbeat for a room full of ghosts. Grace was the first to speak, her voice a whisper of steel. She said that the recording combined with the forged deed was enough to stop the sale and put Colin behind bars for elder abuse, fraud, and extortion. But they had to move fast. Colin knew they had escaped, and he would be moving to finalize the sale immediately to cover his tracks. Ethan stood up, his tall frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the room. He didn't look at the lawyers or the investigators. He looked at Walter and June, who were clinging to each other in the center of the storm. The fear in their eyes had been replaced by a grim, hollow realization. Their son was gone, replaced by a monster of their own making. Ethan reached out and placed a heavy hand on Walter's shoulder. He told them that the time for running was over. They had the truth now, and the truth was a weapon. He looked at Mark and Grace, his eyes hard and uncompromising. He told them to get the paperwork ready and to alert the authorities, but he had one more stop to make. He was going to find Colin, and he was going to make sure the man understood that some things could never be sold. As the rain lashed against the motel window, the group began to pack their gear. The war room was being dismantled, the evidence secured in waterproof cases. The sterile smell of the room remained, but the atmosphere had shifted from desperation to a cold, calculated intent. The hunt had indeed turned. They weren't the prey anymore. They were the reckoning. Ethan led the Ellistons toward the door, his mind already miles away, back at the ridge, back at the house that stood as a silent witness to a lifetime of love and a season of betrayal. The final confrontation was coming, and this time Ethan wouldn't be hiding in the shadows. He would be the storm. A son turned jailer, plus a farmhouse turned prison, plus the cold fury of justice, plus the moment a family's darkest secret is dragged into the morning light. The dawn over Elm Street did not bring the usual warmth of a rising sun. Instead, the sky was a bruised palette of slate gray and charcoal, casting a sickly light over the Elliston farmhouse. The structure, once a symbol of generational pride and agricultural prosperity, now stood like a skeletal remains of a forgotten era. Its white paint was peeling away in long, jagged strips, like dead skin, and the porch sagged under the weight of years of calculated neglect. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the metallic tang of an approaching storm, a silent witness to the rot that had settled deep within the wooden bones of the home. Sheriff Harmon stepped out of his cruiser, the gravel crunching beneath his heavy boots with a sound like breaking teeth. He adjusted his belt, his hand hovering instinctively near his holster, though he expected no armed resistance. Behind him, Ethan and Mark emerged from their vehicle, their faces set in grim masks of anticipation. Ethan's eyes, hardened by years of seeing the worst of humanity, scanned the perimeter. He saw the overgrown weeds choking the flower beds where June used to plant marigolds and the rusted swing set in the distance that hadn't moved in a decade. The silence of the morning was oppressive, broken only by the distant caw of a crow perched on the barn's collapsed roof. Harmon led the way up the creaking porch, steps the warrant clutched in his gloved hand like a weapon. He didn't knock with the hesitation of a neighbor. He struck the door with the authority of the law. The sound echoed through the hollow interior, a rhythmic thumping that seemed to vibrate the very foundations of the house. There was no answer from within. The house felt dead, yet Ethan could sense the lingering presence of the suffering that had occurred behind these walls. With a nod from the sheriff, they forced the entry the lock, yielding with a pathetic snap that spoke of a home already broken. The interior was a sharp contrast to the memories June and Walter had shared. The air was stagnant, smelling of dust, unwashed linens, and the sour scent of cheap cleaning chemicals used to mask something worse. The grand hallway, which should have been filled with family photographs and the warmth of a kitchen fire, was a barren corridor of shadows. As they moved deeper into the house, the evidence of Colin's cruelty began to manifest in physical form. They found the living area where the seniors were permitted to spend their waking hours. It was nothing more than a cold, dark corner of the kitchen furnished with two mismatched plastic chairs and a single flickering bulb hanging from a frayed wire. Mark pointed toward the stairs, his voice a low hiss of disbelief. Along the frames of the bedroom doors on the second floor, heavy iron hafts had been installed. They weren't meant to keep people out. They were designed to lock them in. Ethan ran his fingers over the cold metal of a padlock hanging from the guest room door. The wood around the hasp was scarred with deep gouges, marks left by desperate hands clawing at the exit. The realization hit them like a physical blow. This wasn't a home. It was a private gulag, a place where the elderly were erased while they were still breathing. The sheriff's face grew darker with every step. He reached the end of the hallway, stopping before a small, nondescript door that led to what was once a sewing room. This door, too, was fitted with a heavy sliding bolt and a padlock. Harmon pulled a set of bolt cutters from his kit, the metallic snip echoing like a gunshot in the cramped space. The door swung open with a mournful groan, revealing the locked room where June and Walter had spent their final weeks of captivity. The room was barely 6 feet wide, containing only a twin-sized mattress on the floor and a single wooden chair. Ethan stepped into the room, his breath hitching in his throat. The single window in the room had been boarded up from the outside, but not with simple planks. Heavy plywood had been nailed directly into the siding, and through the gaps Ethan could see where long, rusted nails had been driven through the frame to ensure the sash could never be lifted. The room was a tomb. On the floor, near the head of the mattress, sat a chipped ceramic bowl. Inside was a layer of hardened gray oatmeal, crusty and dry, with a single plastic spoon sticking out of the center like a grave marker. It was the meal of a prisoner, served with contempt. Sheriff Harmon stared at the bowl, his jaw tightening until the muscles stood out like cords. His face transformed into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He was a man who had seen bar fights, domestic disputes, and highway accidents, but the calculated, slow-motion violence of this room was something that touched a nerve of ancient justice. He turned away, unable to look at the bed any longer, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for his radio to call for the forensics team. The silence of the room was now filled with the unspoken screams of the people who had been trapped there. Outside, the sound of a high-powered engine broke the stillness. A heavy pickup truck roared up the driveway, tires spitting gravel as it skidded to a halt near the porch. It was Colin. He climbed out of the cab, slamming the door with a sense of entitlement that set Ethan's blood on fire. Colin was shouting before he even reached the stairs, his voice booming with the arrogance of a man who believed he was king of his own twisted castle. He called out for his grandparents, his tone a mocking blend of feigned authority and irritation, demanding they get downstairs and get to work on the chores he had assigned. Colin stepped onto the porch, his shadow falling across the threshold of the open front door. He didn't see the sheriff's cruiser at first, tucked behind the overgrown hedge. He walked into the house with his chest puffed out, a man coming home to collect his dues. He stopped abruptly in the foyer when he saw the muddy boot prints on the floor and the silhouette of Ethan standing at the top of the stairs. The color drained from Colin's face, replaced by a flickering look of confusion that slowly curdled into fear, As Sheriff Harmon stepped out from the shadows of the hallway, the warrant held high like a death sentence. The heavy wooden door of the farmhouse creaked on its rusted hinges, swinging open to reveal a scene that Colin had never envisioned in his wildest, most arrogant dreams. He stood on the top step of the porch, his chest still puffed out from his walk from the truck, but his breath hitched in his throat as the frigid air rushed into his lungs. The snow was falling in thick, heavy flakes, now creating a white curtain that seemed to isolate the porch from the rest of the world. It was a stage set for a reckoning. Instead of the two trembling broken elders he expected to find cowering in the hallway, Colin was met by the sight of two men who looked like they had been forged from iron. Ethan stood in the center of the frame, his barrel-chested frame filling the doorway. His posture was perfect, the disciplined stance of a Navy SEAL who had spent a lifetime navigating the most dangerous corners of the earth. His eyes, cold and sharp as shards of glacial ice, were fixed on Colin with a level of intensity that felt like a physical weight. Beside Ethan stood Sheriff Harmon. The sheriff didn't look like the friendly local official Colin thought he could manipulate with a smile and a handshake. He looked like an executioner. His hand was already on the leather holster at his hip, and in his other hand, he held a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The metal glinted dully in the dim light of the porch lamp, reflecting the falling snow like a promise of impending doom. Colin's bravado, which had been his shield for so long, began to crack at the edges. He took a half-step back, his boots slipping slightly on the dusting of snow that had accumulated on the porch boards. He tried to force a laugh, but the sound that came out was a high-pitched, strangled croak. He raised his hands in a placating gesture, his fingers trembling despite his efforts to keep them still. "I don't know what you think is going on here," Colin stammered, his voice cracking as he looked from the sheriff to Ethan. "I was just checking on them. You have to understand they're old. They get confused. I've been taking care of them, making sure they have what they need. I'm the only one who cares about this family." Ethan didn't move a muscle. He didn't blink. He simply watched Colin as if he were a specimen under a microscope, a small and insignificant creature that had finally been caught in a trap. The silence that followed Colin's lie was more deafening than the wind howling through the trees. It was a silence filled with the memory of the locked room upstairs, the smell of decay, and the bowl of crusty, dry oatmeal that symbolized Colin's true care. The sheriff took a step forward, the floorboards groaning under his weight. "You have a very strange definition of care," Colin Harmon said, his voice a low rumble of suppressed rage. "We saw the room. We saw the locks on the outside of the door. We saw the way you fed them. You didn't treat them like family. You treated them like livestock you were waiting to slaughter." Colin's face turned a sickly shade of gray. He looked toward his truck, calculating the distance, but he knew he wouldn't make it. He was trapped between the two men and the frozen wasteland behind him. He tried one last desperate gambit, his eyes darting around like a cornered rat. "It's my house," he screamed, his voice rising to a frantic pitch. "I have the power of attorney. I can do whatever I want with this property." That was when the shadows in the hallway shifted. Shadow, the great black dog that had been Walter's constant companion, stepped forward from behind Ethan. The dog didn't bark. He didn't growl in the way a normal dog would. He lowered his head, his ears flattening against his skull, and let out a sound that was primal and terrifying, a low, vibrating hum that seemed to come from the very earth itself. It was the sound of a predator that had finally found its prey. Shadow's lips pulled back, revealing long white teeth that glistened with saliva. His hackles were raised, making him look twice his size. He didn't jump or snap. He simply stared at Colin with a focus that was chilling. It was as if the dog could smell the fear and the rot in Colin's soul. Colin stumbled back further, his heel catching on the edge of the top step. He lost his balance and fell backward into the snow, his arms flailing as he landed hard on the frozen ground. The bravado shattered completely. Colin lay there in the snow, shivering, his expensive jacket soaked through and his face wet with melted flakes. He looked up at the porch, seeing the three figures, looking down at him, the soldier, the lawman, and the beast. He looked small, pathetic, and entirely powerless. The king of the farmhouse had been dethroned in a matter of seconds. Sheriff Harmon descended the stairs with a slow, methodical pace. He didn't rush. There was no need to rush anymore. He reached down, grabbed Colin by the collar of his jacket, and hauled him to his feet with one hand. Colin didn't fight back. He was limp, his spirit broken by the sheer weight of the justice he was facing. The sheriff spun him around and slammed him against the side of the porch railing. The metallic click of the handcuffs was the only sound in the yard, sharp and final. It was a sound that signaled the end of Colin's reign of terror. He began to weep then, a thin, pathetic sound that was swallowed by the wind. He tried to mutter something about his rights, but the sheriff ignored him, tightening the cuffs until Colin winced. Ethan stepped down from the porch, his boots crunching loudly in the snow. He walked over to where Colin was pinned against the railing. He didn't hit him. He didn't need to. He leaned in, close his face inches from Colin's, and spoke in a whisper that was colder than the winter air. It was a voice that had commanded men in the heat of battle, and it carried the weight of absolute truth. "They aren't property, Colin," Ethan whispered, his eyes boring into Colin's soul. "They are heroes. They built this life, and they gave everything to this family. And you are nothing. You are a ghost that we are finally exorcising from this house." Ethan pulled back his expression, unchanged, and nodded to the sheriff. Harmon began to lead Colin away, dragging him toward the cruiser that was waiting in the shadows of the driveway. Colin's boots dragged in the snow, leaving 2 long, ugly furrows in the pristine white ground. He didn't look back. He couldn't. As the cruiser's engine roared to life and its headlights cut through the storm, Ethan turned back toward the house. He saw a figure standing on the porch, framed by the warm yellow light of the hallway. It was Walter. The old man was leaning on his cane, his weathered face etched with the lines of a long and difficult life. His coat was wrapped tightly around him, and his hair was dusted with snow. But something had changed. Walter's back, which had been bowed by years of neglect and the heavy weight of Colin's abuse, was straighter than it had been in a decade. He stood tall, his chin lifted, watching the lights of the police car disappear into the white void of the storm. He wasn't a victim anymore. He was the master of his own home once again. Shadow walked over to Walter and sat down heavily by his side, leaning his large head against the old man's leg. Walter reached down his hand, trembling only slightly, and rested it on the dog's head. The bond between them, which had been the only thing keeping Walter sane during the dark months, was now the foundation of his recovery. The wind continued to howl, and the snow continued to fall, burying the tracks of the predator and the marks of the struggle. Inside the house, Martha was waiting, and for the first time in a long time, the air felt clean. The poison had been removed. The farmhouse, once a prison, was now a sanctuary again. Ethan walked up the steps, joining Walter on the porch, and for a long moment, they both just stood there, breathing in the cold, honest air of a world that had finally been set right. A veteran's legacy against a grandson's cold-blooded greed. A silent courtroom shattered by the recorded echoes of a secret torment. Justice arrives with the crushing weight of a winter storm, revealing that the strongest shields are sometimes held by those who walk in the shadows. The Sandpoint Courthouse stood as a monolith of gray stone against the swirling white canvas of the Idaho winter. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of aged oak floor wax and the heavy, invisible pressure of the law. High above the vaulted ceilings trapped the whispers of the gallery, turning every cough and every rustle of paper into a hollow echo that seemed to judge everyone present before the proceedings even began. The tall, narrow windows were frosted at the corners, blurring the world outside into a hazy smudge of gray and white, leaving the interior of the courtroom trapped in a timeless, amber-lit vacuum. Grace Dalton moved with the calculated precision of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. She did not pace the floor with the usual theatricality of a trial lawyer. Instead, she stood behind the mahogany lectern, her posture as straight and unyielding as a blade. Her eyes, sharp and clear, never drifted toward the jury. They were fixed on the bench, and occasionally they flickered with a cold professional disdain toward the defense table, where Colin sat looking small and frantic in a suit that no longer seemed to fit his ego. Grace didn't start with the financial ledgers or the property deeds. She began with the soul of the betrayal. She spoke of the sacred trust between a patriarch and his kin, and how that trust had been systematically dismantled piece by piece until nothing was left but a hollowed-out shell of a home. Her voice was a steady, rhythmic drumbeat, building a wall of facts that Colin could not climb over. She spoke of the bruises, not just the physical marks that had faded from Walter's skin, but the bruises on the legacy of a man who had survived wars only to be ambushed in his own kitchen by his own blood. The courtroom fell into a suffocating silence as Grace reached for a small digital recorder. She looked at the judge, a silver-haired man named Holloway, whose face was a mask of granite, and then she pressed play. The sound system of the courtroom crackled for a second before the room was filled with the harsh, grating voice of Colin. It wasn't the voice he used in public. It was the voice of the man behind closed doors, venomous, mocking, and cruel. The recordings were a descent into a private hell. Colin's voice lashed out, demanding signatures, laughing at Walter's confusion, and threatening to leave the old man in the cold without his medicine. The audio was raw, punctuated by the sound of breaking glass and Walter's labored, trembling breaths. In the front row, June squeezed Walter's hand so hard her knuckles turned white. She was wearing the soft blue sweater Lydia had given her a small splash of color in the somber room. Walter sat beside her, his face stoic, though his jaw was set so tight it looked as if it might crack. He didn't look at the floor. He looked straight ahead, his eyes watery but clear, reclaiming his dignity with every second of the recording that played. Shadow sat at Walter's feet, a dark, silent sentinel. The dog had been granted a rare exception to remain in the courtroom as a service animal, and he took the duty with a gravity that surpassed many of the humans in the room. His yellow eyes were fixed on Colin, a low, subsonic vibration, occasionally rattling his chest, not a bark, but a warning that only Colin seemed to hear. Every time the recording played a particularly violent outburst, Shadow's ears would flatten, and he would lean his heavy weight against Walter's leg, offering the only comfort that mattered in that moment. Colin's lawyer tried to object, his voice thin and desperate, claiming the recordings were unauthorized and a violation of privacy. Judge Holloway didn't even look up from his notes as he overruled the objection with a single sharp word that sounded like a gunshot. The evidence was overwhelming. The financial trails Ethan had helped uncover were laid bare: shell companies, forged signatures, and the systematic draining of the Elliston estate. Grace presented the documents like she was laying out a funeral shroud for Colin's freedom. As the afternoon sun began to fail, casting long skeletal shadows across the courtroom floor, Judge Holloway leaned forward. He didn't need to deliberate. The evidence wasn't just a mountain, it was a landslide. He looked at Colin, and for the first time, the young man's bravado completely disintegrated. Colin began to shake his eyes, darting toward the exit, but the bailiffs were already moving, positioning themselves like iron statues at the doors. The judge's ruling was scathing. His voice, deep and resonant, filled every corner of the room, echoing off the high ceilings. He spoke of the heinous nature of elder abuse and the calculated parasitic rot that Colin had brought into a house of honor. He ordered the immediate restoration of all property and assets to Walter Elliston. He stripped Colin of every right, every claim, and every cent he had stolen. But he didn't stop there. He sentenced Colin to the maximum term allowed by law for both financial fraud and felony elder abuse, citing the unprecedented cruelty displayed in the recordings. The sound of the gavel hitting the wooden block was final, a sharp crack that signaled the end of a nightmare. Colin was led away in handcuffs, his boots scuffing the floor as he was dragged toward a side door. He didn't look at Walter. He couldn't bear the sight of the man he had tried to break, who was now standing tall, supported by the daughter he had regained, and the community that had refused to let him fade away. The gallery began to clear the tension, slowly draining out of the room like a receding tide. Grace Dalton packed her briefcase, a small, satisfied smile playing on her lips, while June hugged Walter, burying her face in his shoulder. The old man closed his eyes, a single tear carving a path through the deep wrinkles of his cheek, a tear of relief, not of sorrow. The farmhouse was his again. The legacy was safe. Before the room was completely empty, Judge Holloway paused. He remained at his bench, watching as Ethan stood at the back of the room, partially hidden in the shadows of the doorway. Ethan was dressed in his dark tactical jacket, his face as unreadable as ever, with Shadow standing faithfully at his side. The judge knew the legal technicalities of how the evidence had been gathered. He knew that Ethan and the dog had operated in a gray area where the law often feared to tread. The judge locked eyes with Ethan. There was no smile, no formal commendation, but the silver-haired man offered a rare, solemn nod of profound respect. It was an acknowledgement from the official hand of justice to the unauthorized first responder who had held the line when no one else would. Ethan returned the nod, a brief, sharp movement of his head, and then he turned, disappearing into the hallway, with Shadow at his heel melting back into the winter shadows where he belonged. The Idaho winter did not leave all at once. It retreated in slow, reluctant stages, leaving behind a landscape of mud and promise. The jagged white drifts that had once buried the Elliston farmhouse had melted into silver ribbons of water, trickling down the hillsides to feed the thirsty roots of the valley. For the first time in years, the air did not bite at the skin. Instead, it carried the heavy, sweet scent of damp earth and the sharp, invigorating perfume of pine needles warmed by a climbing sun. The silence of the mountain was no longer the oppressive quiet of a tomb, but the expectant hush of a world waking up. The farmhouse itself seemed to breathe again. Every window was flung wide, the lace curtains dancing in a gentle breeze that chased away the lingering shadows of the past months. The dark, cramped feeling of the house had vanished, replaced by a flood of golden light that illuminated the polished hardwood floors and the fresh coat of ivory paint on the walls. It was a house that was no longer hiding its secrets. It was a house that had been reclaimed. Ethan stood on the front porch, his boots planted firmly on the weathered planks. He was hunched over a new handrail for the stairs, his large, scarred hands moving with a rhythmic precision. The sandpaper rasped against the cedar, a steady grounding sound that synchronized with his own heartbeat. He wasn't wearing his tactical jacket today. Instead, a simple gray t-shirt clung to his broad shoulders, damp with the honest sweat of physical labor. The tension that usually lived in his jaw had softened, and the hypervigilance in his eyes had been replaced by a focused, quiet intensity. Every stroke of the sandpaper was a meditation. In the military, he had been trained to destroy, to dismantle, and to survive. Here, under the vast Idaho sky, he was learning to create. He felt the grain of the wood beneath his fingertips, the warmth of the sun on his neck, and the solid weight of his own existence. He wasn't looking over his shoulder for an enemy. He was looking down at his work, ensuring that the wood was smooth enough so that an old man's hand wouldn't catch a splinter. A cloud of dust billowed as he blew on the rail, the golden particles swirling in the light. He heard the crunch of gravel and the familiar hum of a car engine approaching. He didn't tense. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply paused and looked up as Lydia's old sedan pulled into the driveway. She climbed out a bright scarf wrapped around her neck and a wicker basket hooked over her arm. She caught his eye and waved a genuine, easy gesture that Ethan returned with a short but sincere nod. Lydia stepped onto the porch, the scent of cinnamon and warm sugar trailing after her. She set the basket down on a small table Ethan had repaired the week before. Inside were dozens of muffins, still radiating heat from her oven. She looked at the handrail, then at Ethan, her expression one of quiet admiration. She didn't need to say much. They had moved past the need for constant explanation. They were survivors who had found a common ground in the aftermath of a storm. Inside the house, the kitchen was a hive of domestic warmth. June was standing at the counter, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows and flour dusting her cheeks. She was no longer the fragile, terrified woman Ethan had first met. There was a strength in her movements, now a reclamation of her own domain. She was humming a low, tuneless melody as she pressed a circular cutter into a sheet of dough. These weren't ordinary biscuits. They were shadow-sized oatmeal treats, packed with honey and peanut butter. Shadow was, of course, exactly where he always was when June was in the kitchen. The large black dog lay across the threshold between the kitchen and the dining room, his chin resting on his paws. His ears twitched at every sound, and his dark eyes followed June's every move, with a mixture of intense devotion and hopeful anticipation. He was the silent guardian of the household, a living bridge between the violence of the past and the peace of the present. When June dropped a small piece of oat, Shadow's tail thumped twice against the floor, a sound like a muffled drumbeat of contentment. The air in the kitchen was thick with the smell of baking bread and the comfort of a home that was finally whole. June looked out the window, watching Ethan and Lydia talk on the porch. She felt a surge of gratitude, so sharp it almost brought tears to her eyes. They had nearly lost everything, the land, the history, and each other. But the foundation had held. The roots had been deeper than the rot Colin had tried to spread. Then the sound of the front door opening drew everyone's attention. The heavy oak door creaked on its hinges, and Walter stepped out onto the porch. For a moment, a profound silence fell over the yard. Ethan stopped sanding. Lydia paused her conversation. Even Shadow stood up, his ears pricked forward. Walter Elliston was standing tall. His back, once bowed by the weight of betrayal and the physical toll of his age, was straight. Most significantly, his hands were empty. For the first time since the winter had begun, he was not leaning on his silver-topped cane. He took a step forward, his weight shifting onto his right leg, then his left. His gait was slow and deliberate, a testament to months of grueling physical therapy and an iron will that refused to be broken. He walked to the edge of the porch, gripping the new handrail Ethan had just finished. He looked out over his land, the rolling hills, the budding trees, and the distant snow-capped peaks. He looked at Shadow, who had trotted out to stand beside him, the dog's head reaching the height of the old man's waist. Walter reached down and buried his hand in the dog's thick black fur, his fingers trembling only slightly. Ethan watched him, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way that had nothing to do with combat. He saw the pride in Walter's eyes, the sheer stubborn life that burned within the old man. Walter turned his head, his gaze meeting Ethan's. The blue of his eyes seemed to reflect the clear Idaho sky. "Sometimes miracles don't come with wings, son," Walter said, his voice raspy but resonant with a newfound strength. He looked at Shadow, then back at Ethan, his eyes taking in the combat boots Ethan still wore and the steady hands that had rebuilt his home. "They come with Paws and combat boots." Ethan felt something shift deep inside his chest. It was a sensation he hadn't felt in years, a loosening of a knot he didn't know he was carrying. He looked at the old man, at the daughter who had come home, and at the dog who had been his only constant in a world of chaos. He realized then that he wasn't just a guest here. He wasn't just a contractor or a bodyguard. He was home. Ethan's face, usually a mask of stoic neutrality, began to change. The lines around his mouth softened, and a slow, genuine smile spread across his face. It wasn't a smirk or a polite gesture. It was a transformation that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners and lighting up the dark irises with a warmth that had been absent for a lifetime. He looked at the horizon where the sun was beginning to dip, casting long golden shadows across the vibrant green grass. In saving the Ellistons, Ethan realized he had done the impossible. He had saved himself. The war was over, not the one in the distant deserts, but the one he had been fighting in his own soul. He had found a place where his skills were used to protect life rather than end it, and where his silence was understood as peace rather than trauma. He took a deep breath of the spring air, tasting the sweetness of the earth and the scent of the pines, and for the first time in his life, he didn't want to be anywhere else. The sun began to sink lower, painting the sky in bruises of purple and streaks of fiery orange. Below the porch, the first wildflowers were beginning to peek through the soil, tiny, resilient blooms of yellow and white. They were small, but they were their proof that life always finds a way to return, even after the longest, coldest winter. Ethan picked up his sandpaper once more, not because there was work left to do, but because he enjoyed the feeling of the wood. The house was alive, the family was safe, and the shadows had finally been chased away by the light of a new season.